So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We are excited to be together for another Calm Lunch and Learn event. Like I said, we have 30 minutes together, so it's pretty quick. We are joined by Jackson Parr today from UW-Madison Extension, who's going to be talking about the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard. And so after his presentation, we'll have time for that Q&A. If anyone needs help navigating Teams, there is a raise hand function on the top toolbar that you can use during the Q&A, or you can feel free to type in the chat and I can read that out to Jackson. For those I have not met, my name is Lydia Salas, and on behalf of the Calm leadership team, I would love to turn it over to Jackson. Oh, Jackson, let me make sure that you have your microphone. Sorry about that. There we go. Now you should have it.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, you can.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jackson Parr. I am now I am a climate hazards planning educator with UW Extension, but at the time I was working on the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard work. I was a flood resilience fellow with Wisconsin Sea Grant. And so the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard, which we'll talk about in just a bit, was kind of one phase of a three-phase project that was funded through NOAA to help build disaster preparedness capacity for coastal communities in Northeast Wisconsin. So kind of our project area was really the from kind of Sheboygan County in the south up around through Dorr and then up to Oconto County. So we worked with Wisconsin Emergency Management and the Bailey Regional Planning Commission kind of on most of that work. And the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard was really the third phase of a three-phase project, the first phase of which was conducting flood vulnerability analyses for each of the, there are kind of 9 coastal cities in that 7-county Northeast Wisconsin area. So we looked at present and projected rainfall, kind of flood hazard areas, some technical data around flood risk and resilience. Second phase was really looking at, we hosted community flood preparedness events, kind of community engagement events to help develop more of a local organizational capacity in understanding and responding to floods. So worked closely with county emergency managers and other kind of county level organizations on that process. And then our third phase was really doing the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard process. So good timing there, Lydia. It looks like we are all shared. So Lydia, I can just cue you.
Yep, that would be great.
As we're going forward. Yeah, so if you want to go ahead to the next slide, I've kind of done the introduction. Okay, so the plan integration for Resilience Scorecard, I'm going to use the acronym PERS from here on out. It's kind of a long term. But PERS was initially created and it was largely focused on flooding and coastal hazards. More recently, they released another iteration that was really focused on heat. But essentially, it's a process of looking at the different networks of plans within a jurisdiction and identifying incongruities within those plans. It offers a way to help integrate and improve local plans, particularly focused on reducing losses from hazard events, and helps develop on-the-ground capacity for planning as it relates to hazards. So you can go to the next slide. So there's 3 main steps in the PERS process. The first is a technical analysis. So you have to assemble your network of plans, and this can be as inclusive as you'd like it to be. So for our project in Northeast Wisconsin, we did limit it to county hazard mitigation plans and city comprehensive plans. But there are outdoor recreation plans, waterfront development district, transportation, really kind of any number of plans that can be included in this process based on kind of the local decision makers. And from there, you generate your list of policies. So you want to identify the policies within each of those plans that have some kind of relevance to topics of flooding and hazard resilience. Or I should say, I looked at this from kind of a flooding lens, but it could be applicable to kind of any type of hazard event you're interested in. And so those policies, importantly, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about these three components throughout the next 10, 15 minutes, but those policies should be place specific. You should be able to point to them on a map. They should have some kind of discernible effect on vulnerability, either positive or negative. And they should have some kind of policy tool or some kind of government intervention that describes kind of how this policy would actually take effect. From there, you determine your planning districts. So when we did our work in Northeast Wisconsin, we, for a variety of reasons, used the census block group as kind of our delineation of planning districts within a city. You also want to delineate your hazard zones. Again, for flooding, we focus largely on the mapped floodplain area as our hazard zone. And from there, you want to map your place-specific terms. So the examples on the right here are taken from the PERS guidebook. We see the blue area represents the area of the 100-year floodplain and the potential sea level rise. I believe this example was from a coastal North Carolina community. And we see the red dots, we got mapped critical facilities, we've got green areas identifying conservation areas, and then we've got our black lines delineating those planning districts, so kind of the mapping process of these policies. You can go to the next slide. And then step 2 is scoring. So you look at all your policies, you identify those that are mappable, have a discernible effect on resilience or vulnerability, and have some kind of policy tool. So the table to the right, again, taken from the PERS guidebook, we've got those columns showing each of the plans that were analyzed as part of this process: the core land use plan, comprehensive, hazard mitigation, and each of our rows identifies the different planning districts. In reviewing each of the policies within each of the districts, you identify whether that policy has a positive or negative effect on resilience or vulnerability. Allocate either a +1 or -1 to that district for that plan. And then the column all the way on the right shows kind of our combined score for each district. And that's kind of the ultimate score that gets mapped back on to our planning districts. So if you go to the next slide, in addition to mapping our policies and plans, we want to look at physical and social vulnerability. So there's a variety of ways to do this. In Northeast Wisconsin, for the communities we worked with, we developed a flood exposure index that took a few different indicators of potential flood exposure and mapped those onto the census block group. So we had that nice overlay of flood exposure and, or in other words, physical vulnerability on our census block groups. And then social vulnerability. So we took kind of the method, if you will, of the CDC's social vulnerability index, which is available at the census tract level, and we kind of dialed that down to the census block group level. So we had a social vulnerability index and a flood exposure index, both at the census block group level, that we could then overlay onto our scores of plans and policies within each district of the city. So we go to the next slide. So talking a little bit more specifically about kind of how we use this in Northeast Wisconsin coastal cities. So our step 1, this technical analysis, assembling our network of plans. So we were fortunate to have Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission as a partner on the project. And if they did not author each of the comprehensive and hazard mitigation plans that we needed, they knew who did and had it available. So we assembled our network of plans, our comprehensive and hazard mitigation plans for 9 cities and 7 counties in the northeast part of the state. And if you go to the next slide, that next step within our technical analysis is generating our list of policies. So we read through all of the hazard mitigation and comprehensive plans and identified the policy statements within each of those that would have some kind of discernible effect on flood resilience, or at least relevant to flooding and development, potential flood exposure. We've got one example here, continuing to enforce greater setbacks for properties adjacent to Lake Michigan under the county shoreline zoning ordinance. I believe that was taken from a comprehensive plan. And in our comprehensive plans, what we found is there were 248 policies across the 9 plans that we looked at that had some kind of, that were flood relevant. They had some kind of effect on flood resilience, either positive or negative. And there were 32 of those policies that we determined had a negative impact on resilience or would increase vulnerability if implemented. In our hazard mitigation plans, we identified 125 statements across the 7 plans that we looked at that had some kind of effect on flood resilience, and 3 of those negatively impacted resilience. You might expect that hazard mitigation plans would do a little bit more intentional or better job of avoiding negatively impacting resilience than comprehensive plans. So that kind of checks out there in our numbers. So if we go to the next slide. So from there, we need to generate, we've generated our list of policies. What we need though, in order for these policies to go through the PERS analysis process is for each of those policies to be place specific. We got to point to it on a map, have some discernible effect on vulnerability, either positive or negative, and then a policy tool, some kind of government intervention specified that will actually effectuate what the policy is trying to do. So in trying to identify kind of these 3 components across our policies, one example here, again taken from the previous slide, is to continue to enforce greater setbacks for properties adjacent to Lake Michigan under the county shoreline zoning ordinance. We want to see is that policy place specific? Does it have an effect on vulnerability? And a policy tool. So if you go to the next slide, Lydia. And we see, oh, just back one. Yeah, there you go. So we see it checks all three of those boxes. So we've got greater setbacks, generally has a positive effect on resilience, kind of reduces vulnerability. Place specific, we're looking at properties adjacent to Lake Michigan. We can point to those on a map. We know where they are. We can map them onto our planning districts for this process. And a policy tool, how are we going to achieve all that? We're going to do it through the county shoreline zoning ordinance. So we've got kind of those 3 boxes checked there. Now if you go to the next slide, Lydia. We've got another example here, create conservation subdivisions by developing zoning tools that include substantial open space incentives. And again, we're looking for kind of our three components that we need to include in order to be applicable for the PERS process. And if you click to the next slide. So we check 2 of those boxes. We've got an effect on vulnerability. We're gonna incentivize open space. We've got our policy tool. We're gonna do that through conservation subdivisions and other zoning tools, but we're kind of lacking a place-specific term. I don't know exactly where within the city these conservation subdivisions will be going in, and therefore I'm not quite able to map it onto our planning districts and give that planning district an associated score. Just go to the next slide. Another example here, avoid development in or near floodplains, wetlands, existing open spaces, and conservation areas. If you head to the next slide, we'll do another 2 boxes, 2 of 3 checked here. We've got a place-specific term, floodplains, wetlands, open spaces, conservation areas. Generally, avoiding development is going to have a positive impact on resilience, going to reduce vulnerability, particularly avoiding development in these kind of environmentally sensitive areas. But we're lacking a policy tool. How are we going to avoid development in these areas? What's kind of the governmental intervention to make that happen? And I think I have one more example here. If you go to the next slide. So promote coastal hazard awareness, that being a policy in itself. And if you click to the next slide, we see it likely has a positive impact on resilience, reduces vulnerability. We've got increased awareness of coastal hazards, but we don't know exactly, we don't have a place-specific term for this, and we don't know exactly how we are going to go about promoting coastal hazard awareness. So we're missing 2 of 3 of the required components there. So if you go to the next slide. And this was really ended up being kind of a limitation in our application of PERS for these plans and policies. So we do need the terms to be mappable. We need to recognize whether there's a positive or negative impact on vulnerability, and they have to have some kind of policy tool or government intervention. So if you go to the next slide. what we found is looking at our comprehensive plans, 50% of the policy statements that we reviewed lacked one or more of these necessary 3 criteria. And about a quarter of them lacked a mappable place-specific term. So we could not point to them on a map. We could not map them onto our planning districts, which kind of limited our ability to use those policies. And it was a similar story with the hazard mitigation plans where almost 50% of policy statements lacked one or more of the necessary criteria, and about 41% lacked a mappable place-specific term. So then we started thinking, to do a plan analysis process in which right off the bat you're going to be excluding 50% of the relevant policies, that may not be kind of an appropriate way to move forward. So we took something of an alternative approach to the PERS process. And if you go to the next slide. So we reviewed all the policies in each of the hazard mitigation and comprehensive plans, and we provided recommended language that did end up including a place-specific term, had a positive effect on resilience or reduced vulnerability, and then included some kind of policy tool, a way to make that happen. So we have a table similar to this for all of the county hazard mitigation plans and city comprehensive plans. We're kind of working on finalizing the report that would ultimately be posted and distributed. But this is kind of our resulting process, given the fact that some of the limitations in the plan language, or I'm sorry, in the policy language within the plans that we were using, kind of prevented us from doing the entire mappable plan integration for resilience scorecard process. So if we go to the next slide. A few considerations as I was going through this, policies that are not suitable for PERS analysis doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. Promoting coastal hazard awareness, even though it doesn't have a mappable term or a policy tool to do that, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Your policies within plans should, meet the goals of local stakeholders and not necessarily be developed strictly so that they can be analyzed through the plan integration for resilience scorecard. Not every policy should explicitly consider hazard resilience. There's an example kind of in the middle there that's referring to transportation and view sheds. There are policies, particularly within comprehensive plans, that are focused on economic development, transportation, other topics that don't necessarily need language, always considering potential impacts on hazards. And then in a few places, there were these statements of what I call statements of plan integration, which is something essentially codifying this idea that plans should talk to one another and relate to one another. So one of the examples at the bottom there that I took from a plan that we looked at have recommended actions from this plan, which was a hazard mitigation plan, included in the implementation element of comprehensive plans within the planning area. So kind of that statement suggesting that these comprehensive plans and hazard mitigation plans really should talk to one another and agree with each other. So if you go to the next slide, wrapping up here. So some opportunities. I do think there's an opportunity to improve policies related to coastal hazards. So particularly in hazard mitigation plans, there's a lot of attention paid to flooding hazards, but limited specific to kind of the unique aspects of coastal hazards, particularly in coastal counties. I think there's an opportunity to better standardize language across planning documents. So if green infrastructure, natural infrastructure, and nature-based solutions, I'm not sure that there's an agreement on that those are the same thing or they're not. If a county has a mitigation plan, calls something green infrastructure, and a city comprehensive plan uses the term nature-based solutions, that can kind of create another place in which plans can unintentionally conflict. As I mentioned, developing procedures for statements of plan integration, some kind of reference to plans, or making sure that there's some deference to a hazard mitigation plan in cases in which flood vulnerability may be compromised. And then we've really looked at regional entities as a means to scale application of this process. So as I mentioned, we worked closely with the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission, and they have staff that are working on kind of getting up to speed with this process and deploying it in some of the counties and cities that they're working with. And as opposed to training a single planner within a city to be able to do this, I think the regional planning commissions really present a great opportunity to achieve some scale and application, largely because they often are, particularly in rural communities, kind of the primary consultant in hazard mitigation and comprehensive planning process. They often help communities complete those. So they're a great kind of entity to be able to train, for example, the Bay Lake Regional Planning Commission in applying this process, and then you've kind of created some technical capacity to do this across a multi-county area. So I think if you go to the next slide, that is it. And if there are any questions, I know I'm bumping up towards the end of the 30 minutes here, but I'd welcome any questions on PERS or what we did in Northeast Wisconsin.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much, Jackson. Appreciate you running through everything. This was really interesting. Feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand, and we can use the next few minutes to get any questions out to Jackson. I have one while we're waiting for some questions to come in, but you were mentioning using the regional planning commissions as a way to reach multiple communities and kind of scale up the effort. Do you think that this is a process that communities can go through themselves if they're highly motivated, or is there other capacity considerations for going through this process?
Yeah, I think absolutely a community can download the guidebook online, go through the whole process. It does require some, I would say, like intergovernmental cooperation. If you want to, a city wants to also look at the county hazard mitigation plan or other kind of county planning documents. But I do think that there particularly in rural communities, there's a lack of technical capacity, especially if you do kind of have enough policy language to which you would be mapping terms and developing planning districts and identifying physical exposure or physical vulnerability and social vulnerability. There are some kind of technical capacity that I think the regional planning commissions are really adept at. And because those regional planning commissions are often consulting on the development of these plans, I think it's a kind of a natural fit. But for sure, all of this, this process training is all available online for free. So anyone that would be interested can absolutely do that.
Great, thank you. Adam, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Jackson. Were there any common sort of conflicts or issues in the plans that you identified that might be a good indicator that maybe doing the peers or PERS would be a good thing for a community to do before kind of jumping in and doing the whole process? Are there easy sells to kind of be like, yeah, this is kind of a telltale sign that maybe there's some benefit to using the PERS process plans?
Yeah, I think that I would say that kind of the first step, which is to look at existing policies and identify the those kind of three components: the place-based, mappable term, the effect on vulnerability or resilience, and then the policy tool. That doesn't require that much of a robust time investment to review an existing plan and kind of see whether those boxes are checked, if you will. I think, and that was really to the point that we got to, which is looking at each of those policies and determining that there was kind of a limitation in meeting those three criteria to be included in the PERS process, that we didn't go forward with kind of the full mapping and scoreboard. So I think that would be kind of a natural first step, without having to feel like you needed to get into a robust mapping process. Kind of just looking through policies or mitigation actions within the hazard mitigation plan and identifying whether kind of those criteria are part of your existing plans.
Thanks, Jackson. I also had another question for you. You talked about focusing on specifically one hazard. You were looking at flooding for the pilot work that you did in Northeast Wisconsin. Is it possible to look at multiple hazards at one time if communities are going through this process, or is it best to go through for one to actually make the process work for you?
Yeah, I haven't looked too much at the guidebook for assessing heat vulnerability, but from what I gather, each hazard would kind of be its own process because mapping flood exposure doesn't have much bearing on wildfire risk. So there's kind of this mapping and scoring process is likely something that would have to be done for each individual hazard.
Sure.
But that would be an interesting exercise to consider. I'm sure there are policies that would although now that I'm thinking about it, what you could do is just map your entire all hazard exposure area. So that, including wildfire risk, flood risk, coastal hazard zones, and that could kind of be your full hazard area. So I think there's ways to do it. And I think one of the things that we particularly learned is you don't have to do the entire PERS process, full robust analysis to get some value out of just going through some of the exercise.
Great, thank you. All right, well, that's time. So I just want to take a moment to thank Jackson again for joining us this afternoon. And thank you also for joining us for your lunchtime. This is going to be recorded and posted online. So if you want to share it out with anybody who wasn't able to attend today, we'll get that link out to you guys in the next couple weeks likely. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to send them to me. I will throw my email in the chat and I can make sure that they get to Jackson. Otherwise, Jackson's email was up on the screen there. So thanks again, and we hope to see you guys at the next event. Thank you.